Ex-wife listened to the ex-husband's boastful claims until a sealed document reassigned all authority to her. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Sarah Johnson had never imagined that her life would take such a turn. At one point, she had thought that everything was going well with her ex-husband, David Miller. They had their ups and downs like any couple, but they had been together for years. They had 2 children, a house, and a life that many people would envy. However, after their divorce, something inside Sarah shifted. David, once the man she loved, became someone she barely recognized. No longer was he the loving husband who had shared dreams with her. Now, he was a man who bragged about his accomplishments and constantly flaunted his new success. He loved to remind Sarah, at every possible opportunity, about how well he was doing, how his business was booming, how he was dating someone younger, and how much better his life was without her. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off. She told herself that he was just trying to feel better about the situation, maybe trying to prove something to himself. But as time went on, his words began to wear on her. It wasn't just his words, though. It was his behavior. He was condescending, dismissive, and constantly tried to show that he was the one in control. Every time Sarah had to meet him about the kids or any other matter, David would go on and on about how much better things were for him. It started to feel like he was deliberately putting her down, making her feel inferior. And all the while, Sarah was left to pick up the pieces of her life, managing the household, raising their children, and trying to keep things together. But one day, things changed. Sarah received a letter from her lawyer. It was a sealed document, and she had no idea what it contained. She opened it nervously, unsure of what to expect. What she found inside was something that would turn everything on its head. The document gave Sarah more than just the usual legal rights she had fought for during the divorce. It gave her something David never saw coming. The document reassigned control to her. It was a legal decision, something that no one had expected. Sarah, for the first time in a long while, felt like she had the upper hand. Her mind raced with the possibilities. This document could change everything. It could change the way David treated her, and it could even shift the dynamic of their entire post-divorce relationship. She knew this was her chance to take back some of the control that had slipped away over the years. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, relief, surprise, and even a little bit of joy. Finally, she had something that could shift the power back in her direction. It was time for her to take charge of her own life again. And she wasn't going to let David's boasts or arrogance stand in her way anymore. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the sealed document in her hands. The weight of it was still sinking in. For so long, she had felt like she was drowning in the aftermath of her divorce. But now, this document, this piece of paper, had the power to change everything. She thought about how David had always been so confident, so sure of himself. He had made her feel like she was the one who had lost, like she was the one who was powerless. But this was different. She could already feel the shift, the change in the air. The power was no longer in his hands, it was in hers. The next time she would meet David, it would be under completely different circumstances. She had no idea how he would react to this, but she knew one thing for sure, she was ready. As Sarah set the document down on the table, her mind started to race. She thought back to the many times David had boasted about his success after the divorce. He would always tell her about his latest business deals, how he had invested in some new venture, how his new girlfriend was so much more adventurous than she had ever been. Every conversation felt like a reminder that he was moving on, thriving, while Sarah was left to pick up the pieces. But what he didn't know was that Sarah had been quietly rebuilding her life, too. She had gotten a better job, made new friends, and had even started going back to school part-time. She was taking control of her future, one step at a time. And now, this document gave her more than just control over her own life. It gave her control over him, too. It was the perfect opportunity to level the playing field. She had the power to make decisions for their children without his input, the power to challenge him on financial matters, and the power to demand that he respect her boundaries. Sarah didn't know exactly how she was going to use the power she now had, but she knew that she wouldn't let David walk all over her anymore. The thought of confronting him filled her with both excitement and nervousness. She had spent so many years being the one who had to compromise, the one who had to back down. But now, she didn't have to. The tables were finally turning, and Sarah was ready to stand up for herself. When the day came to meet David, Sarah was calm, collected, and ready. She knew that this conversation would be different from any other they had ever had. As she walked into the room, she saw David sitting there, looking as confident as ever, a smug smile playing on his lips. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. She could feel the power shift in the room the moment she sat down. David started talking, as he always did, about his latest accomplishments. But Sarah didn't let him get too far. She interrupted him, holding up the document. "David," she said, her voice steady, "I think it's time we talk about this." David's smile faltered for a second, and Sarah knew that the game had changed. He wasn't in control anymore. She was. Sarah felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just the ex-wife anymore. She was someone who could stand her ground, who could make decisions for herself and her children. As the conversation continued, Sarah was no longer the one sitting back, listening to David boast. She was the one speaking, making her demands, and taking control of her own life. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the upper hand. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Sarah was ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't going to let David dictate her life any longer. Sarah had no idea how David would react to her challenge. She had anticipated a few different outcomes: anger, disbelief, or maybe even an attempt to manipulate her. But when she saw his face as she held up the document, she knew he had never seen this coming. For a brief moment, the smug expression he usually wore faltered. His eyes narrowed, and Sarah could tell that his mind was racing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of confusion. Sarah leaned forward slightly, keeping her composure. "This is the new agreement. It changes everything, David," she said, her tone calm but firm. She could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed the information. This wasn't a situation where his usual charm or arrogance would get him out of it. Sarah had taken the reins, and he was going to have to face it. He opened his mouth to speak but quickly shut it. Sarah could almost see him trying to come up with a response that would keep him in control, but there was nothing he could say. The document gave Sarah the power to make decisions regarding their children's well-being without consulting him first, and that alone was enough to shake David's confidence. It was one of the many ways their relationship had changed, but for Sarah, it was the most important one. She no longer needed to consult him about everything. She no longer needed his approval. David finally sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the situation was settling in. "So that's it then?" he asked, his voice now softer, almost resigned. "That's it," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "We're not going back to how things were. You don't get to just waltz in and make demands anymore. I'm in charge of my life, and I'm in charge of our children's lives. You can't just take that away from me." She could see him process her words, and for a moment, there was silence. It was almost like he was looking at her for the first time in years, seeing her as someone different, someone with power. Sarah could feel the shift happening. This wasn't just a legal document, it was a symbol of her strength, of her refusal to be pushed around anymore. It was a symbol of her taking back control of her own narrative. "You think this is all about the document, don't you?" David finally spoke, a slight sneer creeping into his voice. "You think a piece of paper is going to make me respect you?" Sarah didn't flinch. She knew he was trying to provoke her, but she wasn't going to let him. It's not just the document, David. It's everything I've done to get to this point. The work I've put in, the sacrifices I've made, those are the things that matter. Not your boasts, not your success. And certainly not the way you've treated me for all these years. His face twisted for a moment, and Sarah knew that this conversation wasn't over. But she also knew that, for the first time, she was the one in control of it. As the conversation continued, Sarah made it clear that she was no longer going to be the passive ex-wife who accepted whatever crumbs David threw her way. She was no longer the woman who let his arrogance slide or ignored his insults. She was someone who had stood up for herself, who had fought for her place in the world, and now, with that document in hand, she was taking the power back. The shift wasn't just legal, it was emotional. Sarah knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She wasn't going to let David, or anyone, decide her worth or dictate her future. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but Sarah was ready for them. She was stronger now, more confident, and fully aware of her own value. And with every step she took away from that meeting, she felt more empowered, more in control of her own life. She wasn't going to be anyone's victim anymore. As the days passed, Sarah felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over her. It was as if the weight of years of uncertainty had finally been lifted, and for the first time in a long while, she could breathe. But with that calm came a new realization: she couldn't just let this victory be a one-time thing. The document had given her the legal power, but it was up to her to make sure she used it wisely. She couldn't allow herself to fall back into old patterns, to become complacent again. She had to continue to stand firm. David's reaction had been what Sarah expected, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and eventually, grudging acceptance. But it wasn't easy for him. He couldn't just keep pushing his way through situations anymore. There were moments when Sarah saw the familiar arrogance in him, the same attitude that used to make her feel small, but now it didn't have the same effect. She had learned how to set boundaries, and she wasn't afraid to enforce them. In the weeks that followed, David tried to test her. There were subtle comments, the occasional attempt to undermine her decisions when it came to their children, but Sarah was prepared. She was no longer the passive ex-wife who let things slide. The first time David tried to push her, she calmly reminded him of the new arrangements. "I'm in charge of this now," she said firmly. David didn't like it, but he couldn't argue with the facts. The legal documents were clear, and the court had spoken. Sarah wasn't backing down. But there were other, more personal challenges too. Sarah had spent so many years being defined by her relationship with David. She had been his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, but she was so much more than that. The document had given her the legal power, but now it was time for her to reclaim her sense of self. It wasn't easy. She had to remind herself daily that she was more than just someone's ex-wife. She was Sarah Johnson, a woman with dreams, with ambitions, with a future that was all her own. She began to take small steps towards the life she had put on hold for so many years. She enrolled in a writing class, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. She reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with over the years. Slowly but surely, Sarah was building a life that was entirely hers, separate from her past with David. There were moments, of course, when doubts crept in. There were times when she thought about how easy it would be to just let things go back to how they were. It would be easier to slip into old habits, to allow David to take the reins again. But Sarah reminded herself that she had come too far to give in. She had fought for this freedom, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. As she sat in her small apartment one evening, reflecting on how much had changed, Sarah smiled. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, she was excited about the future. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And nothing, not even David's smug attitude or his attempts to regain control, could take that away from her. The weeks turned into months, and Sarah's newfound confidence continued to grow. She had done what she thought was impossible, she had taken control of her life again. The feeling of freedom was something she had missed for years, and now that it was hers, she wasn't about to let go. With every small victory, whether it was a successful parent-teacher meeting or a promotion at work, she felt herself getting stronger, more sure of who she was. Yet, despite her progress, there were still moments of doubt. David hadn't given up on trying to reassert his influence over her life. He still tried to weasel his way into decisions about their children, especially when it came to their extracurricular activities. But Sarah was prepared. She had learned how to stand her ground and wasn't about to let him walk all over her again. It was one afternoon, as she sat in a local cafe going over her schedule, that she received an unexpected text from David. It was brief, but it carried a weight that made her pause. "We need to talk about the kids' summer plans," the message read. Sarah stared at the screen for a moment, her mind racing. The old Sarah would have immediately agreed to meet, to go over everything David wanted to discuss. But now, the new Sarah knew she didn't have to rush into anything. She could handle this on her terms. With a steady hand, she typed back, "I'll make the decisions about their summer plans. I'll let you know if I need your input." She felt a small but powerful surge of satisfaction as she hit send. It wasn't that she wanted to cut David out of their children's lives entirely, but she had learned that she didn't have to seek his approval for every decision. She didn't owe him anything. A few minutes later, David's reply came, and it wasn't quite what she expected. "You can't do this alone, Sarah. The kids need both of us," he wrote, the familiar undertone of manipulation creeping in. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. She knew this was his way of trying to regain control, of making her feel guilty for making decisions on her own. But she wasn't falling for it anymore. "I'm more than capable of making decisions for our children. I've been doing it for a while now, and I'll continue to do so," she typed back firmly. There was silence after that. For a moment, Sarah wasn't sure what to expect. Would David push back harder? Would he try to make her feel like she was overstepping? But the reply she received was different this time. "Fine. Do what you think is best," it said. There was no attempt to argue further. It was as though, for the first time, David was accepting that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and triumph. It was a small victory, but it was significant. The power shift was becoming more evident in their interactions, and it was something she could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was truly free. She didn't have to answer to anyone but herself. She could make her own decisions, shape her own future, and most importantly, be the mother and person she wanted to be without feeling diminished or controlled. As the days went on, Sarah continued to thrive. Her confidence wasn't just a facade anymore, it was real. She had taken her life back, piece by piece, and now that she had the power, she was determined to hold on to it. She had learned the hard way that she was stronger than she thought, and nothing could take that away from her. As the months went by, Sarah found herself more and more immersed in the life she had built for herself. The changes she had made weren't just surface-level adjustments. They were deep, transformative shifts. Sarah was no longer defined by her past with David or the expectations that had once constrained her. She had learned to trust herself, to make decisions without second-guessing, and to carve out a future that was entirely her own. There were still challenges, of course. The co-parenting dynamic was always a delicate balance, and David, though he had reluctantly accepted his new role, still tried to assert himself at times. But Sarah wasn't about to let him get away with it. She had put up boundaries, and she was determined to keep them. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing up some work at home, her phone buzzed. It was another text from David, and this one, unlike the others, made her pause. "I'm coming by to pick up the kids this weekend. I'll take them for the whole day," the message read. Sarah stared at the screen. Her first instinct was to respond quickly, but she stopped herself. It was a reminder that while she had gained control over many aspects of her life, there were still moments where she had to be careful about how she handled things. Instead of reacting impulsively, Sarah took a breath and carefully considered her response. The kids had been with her for most of the week, and they had plans for the weekend. She didn't want to create unnecessary conflict, but she also didn't want to give in to David's usual demands without considering what was best for them. After a moment's thought, she typed, "The kids already have plans this weekend. They're going to the museum with me. We'll discuss the schedule for next time." She hit send, feeling a small sense of pride in her ability to stand her ground. For so long, Sarah had been afraid of disappointing David or creating tension. She had lived her life trying to keep the peace, even when it meant sacrificing her own wants and needs. But now, she was learning to put herself and her children first. She didn't need to apologize for taking control of her time, her decisions, or her life. David's response came quickly, and this time, it wasn't as combative as usual. "Fine. We'll figure it out next time," he wrote. There was no anger, no attempt to manipulate her. For once, he seemed to accept her decision without question. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. This was another victory, small but significant. It was another sign that things were changing for the better. The more Sarah asserted herself, the more she realized that the power she had claimed was not something that would diminish over time. It wasn't just a temporary shift, it was permanent. It had become part of who she was. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself reflecting more and more on how far she had come. She remembered the woman she had been, the one who let David's boasts and arrogance define her. That woman seemed like a distant memory now. Sarah had become stronger, more confident, and more in control than she had ever imagined possible. She was no longer the passive ex-wife who had to follow David's lead. She was her own person, with her own voice, and with the ability to shape her own future. As she looked at her children, who were thriving in a stable, loving home, Sarah knew that she was doing the right thing. She wasn't just creating a better life for herself, she was giving her kids the example of what it meant to stand up for yourself, to take control of your own life, and to never let anyone make you feel small. Sarah had taken back her life, and now, there was nothing that could stop her from living it on her own terms. Months passed, and Sarah's life continued to evolve. It wasn't always easy, but with each passing day, she felt more confident in the decisions she was making for herself and her children. The power shift was becoming more apparent, not just in her interactions with David, but in her daily life as well. Her work was thriving, her social circle was growing, and she was learning how to take care of herself in ways she hadn't even realized she had neglected. But it wasn't just about external accomplishments. Sarah was growing emotionally, too. She was starting to believe in herself again. She had spent so long doubting her worth, questioning her ability to be both a mother and an individual. Now, she was learning that she didn't have to choose. She could be both. One evening, as Sarah was putting the kids to bed, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't just for the progress she had made, but for the family she had built with her children. They were happy, thriving, and healthy. She had given them a stable environment where they could flourish, and she had done that on her own terms. David still reached out occasionally, trying to get his way, but Sarah had learned how to handle those moments with grace. She didn't need to engage in every argument, and she didn't need to explain herself anymore. Her decisions were hers, and she had the right to make them without seeking validation. One morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast for the kids, she received a call from her lawyer. It was about the final settlement from the divorce, the last piece of paperwork that would officially close the chapter on her marriage with David. As she hung up the phone, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led her to this moment. She had been through so much, but now, everything was falling into place. The life she had fought for was finally her own. The relief she felt was overwhelming. It wasn't just the settlement, it was the knowledge that she had built a life that was hers and hers alone. She wasn't defined by her past anymore, nor by David's influence. She had reclaimed herself. Later that afternoon, Sarah took the kids to the park, and as they played, she watched them with pride. They were growing up in a home full of love and stability. She was doing it. She was succeeding, not because of anyone else, but because of her own strength. And in that moment, Sarah realized something important. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The old Sarah would have been content with just making it through the day. But now, Sarah was setting goals for herself, pushing herself to reach new heights, and most importantly, teaching her children the value of resilience. They were learning that no matter how hard life gets, you can always take control of your own destiny. As the sun began to set and they headed home, Sarah felt a quiet joy in her heart. She had done the hard work. She had faced the challenges, made the difficult decisions, and built a life she could be proud of. It wasn't always easy, but it had been worth it. And as she looked at her children, laughing and playing beside her, she knew that everything she had done had been for them, for their future, for their happiness, and for her own sense of peace. She was a mother, a woman, and a force to be reckoned with. And nothing could take that away from her. As Sarah continued to embrace her independence, life seemed to flow more smoothly with each passing day. The challenges she had once feared now felt like opportunities for growth. She had learned to trust herself, and that trust allowed her to navigate the ups and downs of life with more ease. Her work was thriving, her friendships deepening, and her relationship with her children was stronger than ever. Sarah's life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And that made all the difference. There were moments when she still caught herself thinking about the past, about the years she had spent with David. It was natural, she supposed. They had shared so much together, the good and the bad. But those thoughts were no longer filled with regret or self-doubt. Instead, they were just pieces of her story, and she had learned to accept them as part of who she was, without letting them define her. One weekend, as Sarah and her children enjoyed a quiet day at the beach, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The ocean stretched out before her, vast and endless, and in many ways, it felt like a metaphor for her own life. There was so much ahead of her, so much she still wanted to accomplish, but for the first time, she felt at peace with where she was. Her children played nearby, their laughter filling the air, and Sarah smiled. She had done this, she had created this life for them. She had built something solid, something that would last. In the past, she had worried about the future, constantly wondering if she was making the right choices. But now, she knew that as long as she kept moving forward with confidence, the future would take care of itself. Later that evening, as they walked back to their car, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from David, asking if they could meet to discuss the upcoming school year. She hesitated for a moment. There was a time when she would have dropped everything to accommodate him, to keep the peace. But not anymore. Sarah had learned to set boundaries, to value her time, and to prioritize what mattered most. After a moment's thought, she replied, "I'll handle the school decisions from here on out. If I need your input, I'll let you." No. She felt a sense of pride as she hit send. It wasn't about being rude or dismissive, it was about taking control of her own life. She had learned to stand firm, to assert her needs without feeling guilty. To her surprise, David didn't push back this time. His response was short but respectful. "Okay. Let me know if you need anything." Sarah felt a wave of relief. It wasn't just a message, it was the realization that she had reached a new level of peace in her life. She was no longer trapped in a cycle of resentment or compromise. She had learned how to navigate her relationship with David without losing herself in the process. The next morning, as Sarah sat with her children over breakfast, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. They were happy, healthy, and thriving, and she knew that she had played a huge part in creating that stability for them. But more than that, she had learned to create a stable life for herself. One that was no longer dependent on anyone else's approval or validation. Sarah was finally living for herself, and it felt incredible. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was flourishing. And as she looked at her children, she knew that she was showing them the importance of self-respect, resilience, and the power of taking control of your own life. It wasn't just about creating a better future for them, it was about creating a better future for herself. And Sarah had never felt more certain of anything in her life. As Sarah settled into this new chapter of her life, she began to realize just how much she had transformed. The woman she had been a year ago, unsure, uncertain, and constantly seeking validation, was no longer the person she recognized. She had grown stronger, more self-assured, and most importantly, she had learned to trust herself. It wasn't always easy, but every step had brought her closer to the woman she had always wanted to be. One evening, while making dinner for her children, Sarah found herself thinking about how far she had come. The challenges she had faced were now distant memories, lessons that had shaped her into someone resilient and capable. She had learned to set boundaries, to stand firm in her decisions, and to never again allow anyone to diminish her sense of self-worth. The shift in her relationship with David was the most obvious change, but it was just one part of a much bigger picture. Sarah had learned to say no when she needed to prioritize her own needs, and to refuse to be manipulated or controlled. It wasn't about being angry or resentful, it was about reclaiming her life. And she had done just that. As she sat down to eat with her children that night, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were happy, healthy, and thriving. She had created a life for them, one that was filled with love, stability, and respect. And as a mother, there was no greater accomplishment. But it wasn't just about them. Sarah had also created a life for herself, one that was no longer defined by her past or her relationship with David. She had become her own person again, and that was something she had thought was impossible just a year ago. The freedom she now felt was something she had never experienced before. She no longer needed anyone's approval or validation to feel good about herself. She was confident in who she was, and that confidence had changed everything. But there were still moments when Sarah would hear David's voice in her head, the voice that used to make her doubt herself, question her decisions, and feel small. It wasn't that she didn't still care about their children's well-being, she always would, but she had finally learned to put herself first. She was no longer afraid of taking up space, of asserting her needs, or of making decisions without seeking his permission. That evening, as she tucked her children into bed, Sarah couldn't help but smile. She was finally living the life she had always wanted. A life where she could be both a devoted mother and a strong, independent woman. The two weren't mutually exclusive, and she had learned to balance both. Sarah was no longer the woman who let fear and self-doubt control her actions. She was the woman who took charge of her own future, who had learned to trust her instincts, and who was no longer afraid to take risks. And as she kissed her children goodnight, she knew that she had given them the most important gift of all, a mother who was strong, who was resilient, and who knew her own worth. In the quiet of the night, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long, but it had been worth every step. She had found herself again, and there was nothing that could take that away from her.